안녕하세요. 엑스라인입니다. 미국에서 최고의 UFO 전문가 중 한 명으로 평가받고 있는 리처드 돌란과의 인터뷰를 준비하였습니다. 리처드 돌란은 20년 넘게 UFO 소재를 전문적으로 다루면서 해박한 지식을 바탕으로 냉철하고 객관적인 분석을 통해 UFO 커뮤니티뿐만 아니라 대중매체에서도 인정받고 있는 UFO 전문가입니다. 저희 엑스라인은 리처드 돌란과 지난 3년간 교류하며 정보를 교환하였고 2023년 4월 드디어 인터뷰를 진행하였습니다. UFO 전문가로 변모하기 전인 리처드 돌란은 역사 학부와 석사 과정을 수료하며 냉전 전략, 유럽 역사, 국제 외교를 공부하다 2000년도부터 본격적인 UFO 연구를 시작하였습니다. 리처드 돌란은 UFO를 소재로 다수의 책을 집필하고 출간했는데 그의 대표 저서들은 다음과 같습니다. 1941년부터 1991년까지의 UFO 관련 역사를 정리한 UFOs and the National Security State, UFO 정보 공개가 이뤄질 수 있는 시나리오들과 그 이후의 세계를 그린 AD After Disclosure, UFO를 둘러싼 정치, 은폐, 신과학 등 다양한 연관 내용을 다루고 있는 UFOs for the 21st Century Mind. 또한 리처드 돌란은 여러 TV 시리즈에도 출연하고 있는데 최근 넷플릭스의 국가기밀 UFO 프로젝트에서도 등장한 바 있습니다. 이 외에도 개인 유튜브 채널과 홈페이지도 운영하며 폭넓은 활동을 이어나가고 있습니다. 리처드 돌란은 UFO 역사상 최대의 폭로라고 불리는 윌슨 데이비스 메모의 전문가로도 알려져 있습니다. 이 문서가 유출된 2019년보다 무려 10년 전부터 내용 일부를 습득했었고 그 내용을 공개적으로 이야기해왔습니다. 그리고 리처드 돌란이 10년 동안 이야기해왔던 내용들이 2019년 유출된 메모와 정확히 일치하며 리처드 돌란의 신뢰성 또한 검증이 됐었습니다. 그럼 지금부터 리처드 돌란의 인터뷰 영상을 시작하겠습니다. 무엇보다 윌슨 데이비스 메모에 대한 이야기가 많으니 저희 엑스라인에서 다뤘던 윌슨 데이비스 메모 콘텐츠와 함께 보시면 좋을 것 같습니다. So before we start anything, to the Korean public with the interest in UFOs, could you kindly provide a brief introduction of yourself?
Yes, absolutely. I have been studying the UFO subject for a little bit more than 25 years. I came into the subject during the 1990s. At that time, I was on a path for simply becoming a teacher of world history, Cold War studies, and I was quite serious about that. I was at the time studying a lot of United States national security policy from the 1940s and early 1950s. Particularly, in fact, I was working on a doctoral dissertation dealing with U.S. national security policy just at the outbreak of the Korean War.
No.
So early spring of 1950. And I was looking at a lot of just conventional military documents and national security documents. And that was when I found the UFO subject. I was in a bookstore and I saw a copy of a very well-known book by the UK author Timothy Good called Above Top Secret, The Worldwide UFO Cover-Up.
How old were you?
I was in my early to mid 30s.
All right.
So I'm 60 now. So this was around 1994 or so. And I saw Timothy Good's very, very fine book on the subject. And it was the subtitle that got my attention, The Worldwide UFO Cover-Up. Even in the 1990s, we all knew that there were allegations and claims that there was a UFO cover-up. That's been going on for years. I didn't know anything about it, but I admit I was a bit curious. And I remembered flipping through his book. And I thought, I recognize a lot of the names and a lot of the departments that he had in his book from my own academic studies.
I see.
And it was a bit it was jarring. It was almost upsetting that I'm reading about all of these people and institutions, but in a completely different context. In the academic world, of course, UFOs don't exist. Certainly they didn't in the 1990s. But here he was showing various documents indicating high level of interest by United States national security officials in the 1940s and 50s and beyond. And I just had a very simple question. I thought, is this true? And were American policymakers interested in the UFO subject as he was as he was arguing.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought even if they were interested and it was a mistake, if they were mistakenly interested in UFOs, I still thought, well, that is interesting. Why should that not be part of our history? I just wanted to resolve it for myself. So I decided to take 2 or 3 months out of my life to become familiar with the UFO subject and decide for myself what I thought of it. And of course, that was about almost 30 years ago. And I quickly recognized that there was a tremendous amount of documentation, official United States government documentation, showing exceptional interest at times by highest level American national security individuals in this subject of flying saucers or UFOs. And then I thought, okay, well, why are they interested in it? And I discovered that there were many, many instances of violations of sensitive airspace over military bases in the United States and abroad, elsewhere. I mean, the United States military has a worldwide footprint, so America's military is everywhere. And I discovered that, indeed, the United States military has been tracking these very, very regularly for a long time, and were perplexed by them. So then I asked, well, all right, so they were interested. I can see why. Did they ever resolve this issue? Did they ever figure out what this was to their satisfaction? Did they discover it was the Soviets, the Russians, or any other group? Or was it a secret United States black budget technology program? Obviously, one looks into all of these possibilities. And it was quite obvious that the answer to that was no. They did not really satisfy, they didn't satisfactorily answer the question. What they did do, of course, was tell the public that there was nothing to this, that these were misidentifications and so forth. But that was not an answer. And so I realized there is something serious going on here. This is a real historical phenomenon. It is not explained conventionally to any reasonable degree at all, for the most part. And they were lying about it. And so how is that not an interesting mystery? I thought, I want to know more about this. And, once someone gets to that point in this subject, if you have a curious mind and you want to get answers to things, well, this is a subject that will grab hold of you. And it has done that to me for almost 30 years now.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating.
So I was off into the subject, and I've never looked back.
At which point were you convinced that this phenomena was real? Did it take quite some time for you in your research process, or was it early in the process? When did this time come for you?
Yeah, that's a good question, a fair question. I would say it didn't take me that long. Maybe a few months. It was the review of declassified United States national security documents that convinced me. So, for example, I learned about the now relatively famous Twining Memo. This was by 1947, and a 3-star American general, Nathan Twining. He later earned a 4th star and became Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. But in 1947, Twining was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's United States Air Force headquarters. And he wrote a very now well-known memo in the community. It was classified for many years. And Twining, in September of 1947, is communicating with another U.S. general. And he is saying, this phenomenon is real, not visionary or fictitious. He also described, according to military reports, many of the characteristics that pilots then were seeing. Extreme maneuverability, silent or nearly silent most of the time, exceptional turning and acceleration. And he also stated that they were domed on top and flat on the bottom, like a flying saucer. And in 1947, of course, there's nothing that would be described in that way. So I thought, this is, very interesting. And then I discovered there were quite a few other U.S. declassified military reports that described exceptional airspace violations by objects that looked like flying saucers, that showed incredible maneuverability, and over sensitive places like at Los Alamos National Labs or the Oak Ridge nuclear facility. These especially in the 1940s and 1950s, were exceptionally important for United States national security. This is where nuclear technology was developed. There was a place called the Hanford Nuclear Facility in the state of Washington on the west coast of the United States that they produced plutonium. And in the early 1950s, there were a series of extraordinary UFO sightings over the Hanford plant. And, you know, at a certain point, you just have to look at this with some common sense and ask yourself the very same question that US analysts were asking at the time, which is, okay, is this the product of the Soviets? It's a necessary question. But, you know, the thing is, they looked at it back then and they concluded, no, this cannot be. And you look back historically, and there is not a shred of a reason to believe that the Soviets would have been responsible for these. And so now what are you left with? Perhaps a classified black budget program where was America secretly building flying saucers of exceptional capability. But then again, you come up to the absolute lack of any historical foundation for that belief. There's no reason, there's no evidence whatsoever that America had developed this. It's not that they weren't uninterested. It's not that we didn't have our own group of captured German scientists from the Second World War, and some of whom were looking into exotic technologies, apparently. Mm-hmm. But still, there is no evidence whatsoever that the United States was developing this either. And so now what are you left with? There's no other nations in 1950, 1949 that would be responsible for this. None. Exactly. And this is why in the United States classified world at the time, there was a very strong contingent of analysts who said this must be interplanetary. That's the word that they were using back then. And of course, what you found is that anytime any of those classified groups came to such a conclusion, they were typically broken up and dispersed. Mm-hmm. And so that's very, very suspicious things going on here. So there's a cover-up, not simply by the government and the military to the public, but within the military itself, to keep this subject very, very contained, which it has been, I think, for all of these years since that time.
I see. It's quite disheartening to see that history seems to repeat itself. I mean, America had a public hearing few days ago, and again, they're talking about, you know, potential adversary craft from either China or Russia. Of course, these crafts cannot be from China or Russia, but the history seems to repeat itself. So I'm seeing your YouTube coverage on that as well.
Yes, yeah. In the last decade, perhaps one might make an argument that either the Russians or the Chinese might possibly have such capability. Mm-hmm. But then you look at the reality. When you look at UFO incidents off the U.S. Atlantic coast, all right, I can tell you right now, there's absolutely no chance that China could be behind it. Mm-hmm. China does not have a global naval presence to begin with.
Right.
And certainly not in the Atlantic Ocean. In the Pacific Ocean, one could see the logic, not the Atlantic. And getting to the Atlantic, you look at the geography of this planet, getting a significant military presence out there for China, as capable as it is not realistic at this point. You have U.S. analysts who currently think, well, the Chinese might be able to get something in the Atlantic, you know, in another decade. But no, there's nothing there right now. And the same applies to the Russians, frankly. Mm-hmm. And when you go back prior to even the last decade, you look at Russia, you look at China, you know, think of something like the famous Tic Tac UFO incident now, which is in the Pacific off the North American coast there. Mm-hmm. 2004. Right. First of all, the Russians were in absolutely no position whatsoever, even remotely, to consider sending a probe out there. The Russian military in 2004 was a mess. They're much more capable now, yes, but not in 2004. And their high technology, they've always had good technological capability, but no, this is absurd. Particularly geopolitically, the Russians in 2004 actually were trying to get into NATO in 2004. They were very friendly, frankly, with the United States. And the Chinese were growing, they were developing their capabilities, but they were not there in 2004, not at all. So there are no candidates. And so at this hearing that we just had 2 or 3 days ago, where the U.S. Senate interviewed Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, who is running the current UFO program now that we have, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. ARROW is the acronym.
Right.
It was disturbing. It was distressing to see such an emphasis by the panel to ask him, essentially conflating all UFOs or UAP with the Russians and Chinese, as if they're doing this. And then the whole balloon episode took up, I mean, what a farce I consider that to be. That took up such an incredible amount of time, where they were really just looking at all these UFOs as what, Chinese balloons, really?
Mm-hmm.
Well, a lot of attention was spent on that. So no, the hearing itself was farcical and a bit of an embarrassment. It really should not have happened that way. And I don't consider it a serious conversation on the subject of UFOs at all. If anything, you could see in that hearing, the emphasis was to take all the mystery out of the UFO subject and to make it as conventional as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a longstanding United States policy, by the way. 70 years ago, the CIA organized something called the Robertson Panel. It's somewhat well known, at least in UFO research. Mm-hmm. And this was in January 1953, and they organized this scientific panel, supposedly to investigate the UFO or flying saucer mystery. It was a panel where we know now, historically, the conclusion was submitted even before they met, and it was going to be a negative conclusion. The point of the Robertson panel was to demystify the UFO subject to the public. At the end of that, they made a determination. They said, well, we're going to now work with the media, like Disney Corporation and news media and the rest, to educate the public on, the fantastical, ridiculous nature of these flying saucers was the whole point. So it was a complete debunking operation that they initiated then, and it has never stopped. It has gone to this very day.
Well, I agree with you on totally that. It's interesting to see that you're picking up these historical and geopolitical contexts of these adversary nations, and I agree with you totally on that. We have to look into the UFO history, but that it seems that the recent hearing does not seem to consider any of the history on UFOs. So
no, that's correct. That's correct. In fact, really, what I think one can see when we look at the last 5.5 years now of the UFO culture. I mean, since the end of 2017, the public conversation on this subject has changed quite a bit. Mm-hmm. The New York Times, of course, published 2 articles at that time on the apparent reality of UFOs, and it was really quite powerful. And so that's interesting. But what we've seen is, the U.S., the Pentagon and the intelligence community have been very, very effective at managing the discussion of this subject, I think, very well. And one thing that they have done is remove the history out of all of it. So they essentially have this attitude publicly where they say, well, this seems to be a new phenomenon. We have to look into this. What is going on here? There may be something out there. We'll study it and we'll get back to you when we have an answer. That's essentially their attitude. And I mean, that is disingenuous. It's not honest. Mm-hmm. They have been dealing with this for 80 years at a minimum, 80 years since the 1940s. And we know this for a fact. And we know that this has been considered a very serious problem for many, many decades. Mm-hmm. And so one has to ask, if you, the Pentagon, are acting as though this is something new, where is your historical documentation on this? Are we to believe they have not gathered any of the historical evidence together on this, including times when these objects certainly appear to have shut down nuclear warheads, nuclear missiles? Mm-hmm. We have a number of instances of that historically. And that's just the beginning. Right. There have been countless cases of dangerous jet intercepts of these objects You yourself, before we began this, you were showing me an incident from dealing with the South Korean military from 1980, which was quite extraordinary and very typical, I should add. It's extraordinary, but it's been repeated throughout the world. Is one really to believe that the militaries have not been highly concerned with this for years and years and years? And so the U.S. attitude, the Pentagon's attitude, is clearly not honest. Of course, I think we should expect that. And unfortunately, they have a very strong influence over the major media, and they're able to get their messaging out pretty effectively.
Well, looking at the bright side, however, there has been some credible people saying that there are going to be some whistleblowers coming out talking about crash retrieval programs, and such person that I could think of is Professor Gary Nolan from Stanford. He has mentioned
Yes.
numerous times that whistleblowers is soon to come out, possibly sometime this summer. And with that crash retrieval program, this term has been hot topic, especially lately. And with that, the Wilson Davis memo that you're very fond of, it has become a subject of questioning in congressional hearing as well. As one of the first individuals to bring up this topic, how do you feel about this development? And additionally, were there any recent discoveries that bolster the credibility of this memo, in your opinion?
Yes.
Let me just jump in a little bit. Our YouTube channel
Please.
was the first and only channel to introduce the Wilson Davis memo
In Korea.
to the Korean audience, and which included you and your work on the memo. And we tried to provide a comprehensive and detailed coverage, ensuring that our audience gets the all the essential information accurately. And so our audience kind of know the Wilson Davis memo, and also you. I just wanted to let you know before you answer the question.
Did not know that. Okay, well, excellent. That's a very important memo. If someone has not heard of it yet, we can say it's not an official United States government document. It's not that at all, but it's an important document indeed. And essentially, it comes down to the written notes by Dr. Eric Davis, who's a very well-known individual, from his meeting with a retired United States admiral named Thomas Wilson. This conversation took place in 2003, and it refers to something that Wilson was involved in 2002, my mistake. It refers to something Wilson was involved in 1997. Essentially, a group of researchers, one of them was Dr. Stephen Greer. He was accompanied by astronaut Dr. Edgar Mitchell of Apollo 14 and a few other individuals. And they were able to have a meeting with Thomas R. Wilson, who at the time was deputy head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States. It's a very important position. And they were able to meet with Wilson and also Wilson's supervisor, General Patrick Hughes. But they essentially made the argument that there are deeply classified programs within the Pentagon's structure that are dominated by private contractors. They don't have any oversight, as far as they could tell, and that they were concerned with the reverse engineering of alien technology. That's essentially what they argued. Wilson seemed to be interested enough, this is in 1997, to say that he would look into it. And in fact, he did look into it. It took him about 2 months to find a paper trail and to find programs, several programs, dealing with this type of activity. He contacted what he thought was the best candidate. He ended up speaking to 3 of what he called gatekeepers. So that was the program manager of the program, the security manager, and the corporate attorney. Very interesting, the corporate attorney. They eventually agreed to meet with him. He flew out and he said, look, it is your mistake that I have not been brought in to oversee this program. It is part of my job. And they said, well, no, it really is not part of your job. He said, yes, it is. And you need to bring me in. They said, no, we don't need to bring you in. They did tell him what the basics of the program were. They had to tell him something. He had flown all the way out there. They knew he was angry. He had the potential to cause trouble for them. And so they did say, yes, we have a craft. It's an intact craft, not from our civilization. They said, not made by man, not by human hands, was what they said to him. And Wilson said, well, I need to be part of this. They said, no, why not? We cannot tell you. We don't need to tell you. He said, well, I'm going to complain to my supervisors. They said, go ahead. We're not afraid. He did go back to Washington. He did complain, and he was threatened with his career. They said, look, if you want to continue to complain, we'll just, you'll take an early retirement and lose 1 or 2 stars along the way. And so Wilson was angry, but he gave up and he played along. But when Mitchell, Edgar Mitchell was one of the people who initially spoke with Wilson. Well, Mitchell learned about the aftermath of this and spoke with his colleagues who were associated with Robert Bigelow and the National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS. This included people like Bigelow, like Dr. Kit Green, like Dr. Hal Puthoff, like Dr. Eric Davis, Dr. Colm Kelleher, and all of these individuals. Jacques Vallet learned about it as well. He was part of that great researcher, Jacques Vallet. And so this small group knew all about the meeting, and they wanted to get more details. And they waited for when Wilson retired from government service in 2002. They were able to arrange a meeting between Wilson and one of their group, Dr. Davis. Davis flew out to meet with Wilson and did an extended interview with Wilson, after which he took detailed notes. And those notes are the Davis-Wilson notes. They were very carefully kept for several years. However, I was shown several pages of those notes by one of those individuals at the end of 2006, in 2006. And in fact, I as a result, I called Thomas Wilson myself and interviewed him.
Wow.
I did indeed. And it's the only time in my career that I didn't give an honest reason for wanting to do the interview with him. I just said I was doing standard research on the U.S. Navy and his background, and that's how I was able to get in. And immediately when we started talking on the phone, I said, well, sir, the truth is I'm a researcher of the UFO subject, and your name came up in this important context. So he became very interested. He wanted to know everything about that. And then he just ended the phone conversation. He said, well, that's all poppycock, which is like, that's ridiculous. But of course, it's not ridiculous. And he had to deny it. But I knew about these notes for all of this time, and I spoke about them publicly. I didn't speak about the notes per se. I was asked not to talk about the notes, but I was asked to talk about the information that I had. Or I was allowed to talk about the information, but without mentioning the notes. And but then the notes came out in the spring of 2019. And when I saw them, I knew exactly what they were. So yes, they are very important. So really what they are is a conversation between two individuals with highly classified clearances about an explosive topic, the acquisition of a flying saucer by the United States military-industrial complex, and the fact that there didn't seem to be any proper channels within the United States government truly to manage this program. This is run by a contractor. Most people think perhaps Lockheed Martin, perhaps it's Northrop, perhaps there may be there's a few other candidates, Boeing, perhaps, but it's a significant private contractor that essentially runs this more or less on their own, as far as anyone can tell. And that's a significant thing. And, getting to the bottom of the secrecy here this is a difficult thing to do, because what we are finding is that the UFO secret isn't simply classified. It's, in a sense, proprietary at a certain level, where you have these private corporations that have control over some of this information and technology, and they are not amenable to freedom of information requests, not nearly to the same degree as a government agency is. So it really helps with the secrecy. And I think this is a big part of the secrecy structure that ordinary people ought to understand.
Especially with the compartmentalization nature of these secrets within the government. You have recently provided an in-depth analysis of Jacques Vallet's fifth edition of Forbidden Science, and
Indeed.
a major revelation concerns the ongoing secrecy surrounding the craft retrieval programs over the years.
Yes.
And again, do you expect any form of disclosure regarding these UFO retrieval programs? Especially with Wilson memos getting such interest lately?
Well, the Wilson memo received a comment in the previous U.S. congressional UAP hearing,
right,
from about a year ago, almost. I was very pleased. I was a bit surprised that it was mentioned in the public context like that. That was good. Of course, if you recall, when the two Pentagon representatives were asked about that memo, that's Ronald Moultrie and Scott Bray, they both said, "Oh no, we're not familiar with that. We don't know what that is," which maybe they don't know, but I think somebody there knows. So there's not. I'm not aware of any government comment about that document since then. So I'm glad that it got a public note. But in terms of, well, let me answer your question about Vallet, first of all. So Jacques Vallet is, perhaps the most prestigious UFO researcher in the world these days. I don't know. He's in his 80s. He's been doing this for many, many decades. He's a brilliant man. And he also is very close to the individuals that I was just mentioning, the scientists who are with Bigelow and so forth. And Vallet has been publishing his journals, his diaries, that he had been writing for years. And they're outstanding reading, frankly. So he just published recently his journals covering the years from 2000 to 2009. And in that journal, there are many references to the Wilson Davis situation. He was clearly familiar with it from close to the beginning, wrote about it extensively, and makes it obvious that these notes are real. I say this because when those notes leaked out in 2019, there is a very vocal contingent of researchers who said that these were fake, they were a hoax, and all of this nonsense. I knew better, and I said so many times that these notes are legitimate, but still there were many, many vocal individuals who said, no, it's a hoax, like, government disinformation and whatever. So now there have been many statements from people close to the documents that have made it quite clear that they are real. A journalist, George Knapp, for example, who's also very close to all of this, he said, yes, they are real. Leslie Kane, the journalist, who's fairly well known, has also in the last few years said, yes, they are absolutely legitimate. Leslie told me early on, privately, that she knew that they were real, but she said, well, I have to be careful. I can't talk about it right now. But she has since come out about it. Now, Jacques Vallet is perhaps the best of the sources so far, and he has made it absolutely crystal clear that, yes, everyone in that group has been talking about those notes. One of the individuals that I interviewed, and I cannot mention his name, but in that circle of scientists, said to me, I have known about those notes since day 2. So apparently the next day. So they've all known about it. It's all real. And Vallet simply provides more information. The other thing about Vallet's journals that I just thought were significant is he really mentions in them that there were at least 3 instances in recent history where this kind of a program was in danger of being publicized, was in danger of being outed. And some of this really ties in very well with the Wilson Davis notes, by the way. So Vallet mentioned U.S. Comptroller General in the 1980s and 90s. This is someone who's managing all the finances and looking over, all of that. A gentleman by the name of Charles Boucher. I didn't know previously who Charles Boucher was, but for, I think, 16 years, through the Ronald Reagan presidency, 8 years of that, through the George Bush Sr. presidency, and then through the first 4 years of Bill Clinton's presidency, this man, Charles Boucher, was United States Comptroller General. And Vallet wrote about something that he learned, that in the mid-1980s, Boucher stumbled, he was doing an audit of the Pentagon, and apparently found this program that Wilson found a little over 10 years later. And Boucher, according to Vallet's notes, was essentially silenced by, as a result of his audit. And what you learn in the Wilson notes is that that program had been subjected to an audit some time before, and they had to bring that auditor into the program. They had to, in other words, brief him, thereby ensuring secrecy. Because once you're briefed on the program, you are not allowed to talk about it, ever. And so that's how they silenced Boucher. Boucher died not long ago, by the way. So Vallet mentioned that in his notes. That was quite fascinating. And then he mentioned another instance where we don't have an actual date, but perhaps late 80s or early 90s, with another United States general who apparently learned about this program. And then, of course, in Vallet's notes, we have there's a lot of description of what was going on with Thomas Wilson. So Vallet's last published book, these journals, have, by my count, 3 instances that he talks about where you have leading individuals within the U.S. military or government establishment who found these programs and were angry about the secrecy, but were unable to do anything about it. I think that's quite significant.
It's quite fascinating. I mean, Wilson wasn't the first one. It started way back. Fascinating.
The third person you mentioned is General Sheehan, right?
Yes, thank you. I was trying to remember the name and it didn't ring. I don't have the notes in front of me. Yes, General Jack Sheehan. And he had the position of head of operations for the Joint Chiefs. So Wilson's title was Deputy Head of Intelligence. That's J2. Head of operations is J3. And that was Sheehan's position just a few years before Wilson. So in the early 90s. General John or Jack Sheehan was in his position. And I would guess that is probably when he had his own encounter with this program. We don't know the year that Sheehan had this, but it was mentioned by Vallet. Somehow he learned about it. It's not surprising that he would learn about it because, again, that circle of individuals, people like Dr. Kit Green or Hal Puthoff or Eric Davis, and others, they're all very nicely plugged in one way or another to the classified world. And, people talk quietly about some of these things, and Vallet learned about it, and he wrote about it in his journal.
Those 3 cases.
Yeah, thank you for telling me about Sheehan.
No problem at all. And I have a personal question. I know I followed your work, and I've seen most of your videos on your channel. And you never mentioned who this person is, the person who showed you the couple pages of Wilson Davis' memo in 2006, and you never mentioned or reveal who that is. And we are expecting that someone from NITS, obviously that's what we expected, but are you ever going to reveal this information?
Yes, if I get permission from him or if he dies.
Okay.
I'm not, I think, look, there have been a few people who are paying close attention, who have figured it out. And they have put this person's name out there as their best guess. And many of them have been correct, but I'm not saying. I think this gentleman, it's an open secret perhaps, but the reason that I'm not going to betray his trust on this, all of those individuals are they are walking a very fine line. So in my opinion, at least some of them do actually believe that the public should know more than it knows on this subject. And that's why from time to time, they will quietly talk with various, various UFO researchers that they trust and so forth, and they'll give little tidbits, little breadcrumbs of information, which is what happened to me. So they do that because I think they are interested, and they, on a limited basis, have shared it with people that they've trusted. But if these individuals were to be known as leaking such information, they themselves would lose access, very possibly, to any of the classified, any of the clearances that they have. At least there's a danger. And they all want to get to the center of the maze. They all want to get to the center of the secret. And it wouldn't be ethical, in my opinion, to give up his name formally. I actually, when the notes came out, I practically begged him. I said, will you please let me use your name here? Think about a legacy. Think about what you could be doing for the rest of the world. And he said, I'm sorry, I just won't. I have emails back and forth, and I've got all the information to prove who he is. And assuming that I outlive him, that day will come when I do that. But I just can't in good conscience do it while he's around and hasn't given me permission.
Thank you.
Perfectly understandable.
Yeah, I always wanted to ask you that question. So
yeah, no, I don't blame you at all.
I have my thoughts, but since we cover most of the people you mentioned, the NIDS people, during our channel, we talked about them, and one of the questions that we always talk about among ourselves with Chinu and me and someone else is who actually gave you that memo, and that person actually knows the whole thing.
Well, he does know the whole thing, but also his colleagues know the whole thing as well. They all know the whole thing. They all do.
Then it doesn't really matter who gave it to you, because the whole NIDS know, right?
There's not a shred of doubt. They all know, every one of them. No, there will be a day when that man's name is out and is confirmed, but I can't in good conscience do it yet.
As far as I know, the Whistleblower Protection Act is in the works. I hope that falls through so that more people can come out.
Well, it will help in some cases. It will not help in all. So it will not help in the instance of this gentleman who gave me information. He's not going to do it because a lot of the classified world is like the mafia. People should understand. It's come to my understanding that in many cases, sensitive information does not even require you to sign a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA. It's just simply known that if you are to give up information that you are not supposed to give up, you will suffer consequences.
Right.
Now, what are those? In the early period of my investigation of the Davis-Wilson notes, this is back in 2006, 2007, I wrote to astronaut Edgar Mitchell, and I had said to him, I said, look, you tell me that you like the work that I do. Thank you. Can you please help me out here? I said, you have told me that on 2 occasions, you spoke to high-level individuals who confirmed to you the existence of programs to study alien technology and indeed alien bodies. I said, I realize you can't give up their names, but can you give me any hints, anything whatsoever? This was me back in, I think, late 2006. And Mitchell wrote back, he said, I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but no, I cannot tell you. And this is what he said, that the people who came to me with this information, or I think that's how he said it, did so at great risk, professionally, personally, and to their families. That's exactly what he said. And he said, as long as they're alive, there is no way that I will betray their trust. Now, what does that mean? Risk to their families? Well, maybe it's simply financial risk that you lose your job, but I don't know. I don't really know what he meant. So this is a thing in which the secrecy, it's not always formal. And so when we talk about a Whistleblower Protection Act, yes, during the hearing just the other day, the question was asked by Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick about the whistleblowers. She said, you know, this is important to us. Have you had whistleblowers? And he said, yes, as a matter of fact, we've had about, I think he said 25 or so of them. And he didn't give any indication as to what the information was. And my impression, and I could be wrong, but I had the impression that he really tried to downplay their importance altogether. Now, I think whistleblower protection can potentially be very good. But if you notice the way that they handled that in the hearing, whistleblower, yes, to the classified world, not to the public. So there would be whistleblowers coming to the ARROW program, the UFO program there, to give their information to him without fear of legal repercussions. I'm not sure. Maybe I should read the fine print of the law more carefully, but I'm not so sure that it means that you can just talk to the public about it. That would be an interesting legal point to look into. But the impression that I got in the hearing was simply that they come to his office, because think about it, he's gotten 25 of them so far. We haven't heard about them. I haven't heard a thing about them. So they are whistleblowers in the sense that they're speaking to a classified part of the United States government. Will that information ever reach the public is an unanswered question, and I'm not sure that it will.
Makes sense.
I've been accused of having a bleak view sometimes of the future of secrecy and of disclosure. Over a decade ago, I wrote a book called After Disclosure. I co-authored that book. And, you know, my co-author and I tried to hypothesize under what conditions the end of UFO secrecy might happen, what could cause it. And then the other part of our book was, if that were to happen, how would that affect our world? You know, it was an interesting project to do. When I look at it now, I think it's going to be a very difficult thing to achieve. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think that the United States military and intelligence community have a very capable group of people in managing this information. And they have basically a compliant media that hardly ever asks difficult questions about this. My attitude is, if they can drag this secret out for 5 more years, they'll do it. And if they can drag it out for 50 more years, they'll do that. And if they can drag it for 100 years, they will do that. They'll extend this secret as long as they possibly can. And then when it finally ends, if one day it might end, well, they'll deal with that problem at the time. But right now, I think, as far as I can see, they're just extending this out to, and they're very effective.
As much as possible.
Yeah, they're very effective. I mean, think of it this way. 10 years ago, the governments of the world, and certainly the United States government, didn't even acknowledge that there was a UFO problem, really. They said, no, we looked into it, there's nothing there. Now we're at a stage where they say, well, there does appear to be something. And like, there does appear to be something? Well, it's a little bit more than that. But so they're just inching along. It's slow acknowledgments. It's like in American football. You've got the football, you got to move it down the field. And they're playing defense. But they have the football so far down in the enemy's position that they're doing great. And they've moved back just a tiny bit, but there's an entire field remaining. And I think that's where they're at. They're in a good position. They are playing a delay game very effectively, as I see it.